November 17th, 1998. Cedar Ridge, Montana woke up under a sky the color of cold steel, the kind that pressed low and heavy, as if winter itself was already leaning down to listen. By 7 in the morning, the frost had already settled thick along the fences, and the wind carried that sharp bite that told every farmer in the valley one thing: they didn't have much time left. At the far end of Miller's Road, where the gravel gave way to packed dirt and silence, there stood a narrow, leaning workshop with a faded wooden sign that read, "Turner Repairs." The paint had peeled years ago. The door hung slightly crooked, and yet smoke still curled gently from the chimney, steady as a heartbeat. Elias Turner was already awake. He stood alone inside sleeves rolled up, hands blackened with grease that never quite washed out anymore. His movements were slow, deliberate, not the slowness of age, but the patience of someone who had learned long ago that rushing a machine was the fastest way to break it. A rusted carburetor sat open in front of him, pieces laid out like a puzzle, only he could see clearly. That was when the sound came. Not one engine, not two, but a convoy. The low rumble of multiple trucks broke the stillness of the morning, growing louder, sharper, until even the loose bolts on the shelves began to hum. Elias didn't look up right away. He simply paused, listening, counting. 5 vehicles, maybe 6, heavy, new engines. He wiped his hands on a cloth, stepped toward the door, and opened it just as the first black pickup swung into view, tires crushing frost beneath them. Behind it came another, and another. Polished chrome. Clean bodies. Company decals shining like badges of authority. Hawkins Agritech. The trucks didn't stop gently. They pulled in fast, aggressive, forming a loose semicircle around the front of the shop. Doors slammed open almost in unison, and men stepped out. Jackets, crisp boots, clean faces, carrying the easy confidence of people who had never had to fix something twice. At the center of them was Richard Hawkins, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark coat that looked too expensive for a place like Cedar Ridge. He glanced once at the shop, then at Elias, and something like amusement flickered across his face. "Well," Richard said, his voice cutting clean through the cold air, "so this is where the past comes to die." A few of the younger men laughed. Elias didn't answer. He simply stood there, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. Eyes steady. The tailgates dropped, and then it began. One by one they started unloading. A cracked hydraulic jack, a seized-up auger motor, a control module from a newer tractor, wires torn and hanging loose. Metal hit the frozen ground with dull, heavy thuds. Not placed, not handed over. Thrown. Within minutes, a pile had formed in front of the shop tools, and machines stacked carelessly like scrap. Richard stepped closer, brushing invisible dust from his gloves. "These," he said, gesturing casually to the heap, "are the things our customers bring us when they think something's still worth saving." He tilted his head slightly, looking at Elias as if studying an artifact. "We figured, why not give you a chance? Let you prove that all that old wisdom still counts for something." Another ripple of laughter. One of the engineers, a young man with sharp features and a grin that came too easily, picked up a broken gear assembly and held it up. "You know what this is?" he said loudly, turning so the others could see. "It's part of a torque regulation system, computer-controlled. You don't fix this with a wrench and a prayer." More laughter. He tossed it back onto the pile. Richard stepped in closer now, close enough that the distance between him and Elias felt deliberate. "Truth is," he continued, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal, "people like you had your time. But the world moved on. Machines moved on." He gestured back at the trucks. "Precision. Efficiency. Systems that don't rely on guesswork." His eyes flicked down to Elias's hands, rough, scarred, stained. "You wouldn't understand that." A few people from the town had begun to gather by then. Farmers, passers-by, drawn by the noise. They stood off to the side, watching, some with curiosity, some with quiet agreement. No one spoke for Elias. The young engineer stepped forward again, unable to resist. "I mean, look at this place," he said, spreading his arms toward the workshop. "No diagnostic tools, no software, no updates, just—" He shrugged. "Ears and instincts." He laughed, shaking his head. "That's not engineering. That's guessing." And that was the moment when everything could have turned loud. Angry, bitter. But Elias Turner didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't even move. He simply looked at the pile of broken tools, then at the men who had brought them, then briefly at the small crowd that had gathered. And for just a second there was something in his eyes. Not anger, not shame. Something quieter. Something older. Richard straightened his coat. "Here's the deal," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear now. "You fix them, we'll come back. We'll pay you whatever you think your time is worth." He paused, a thin smile forming. "But if you can't..." He let the sentence hang unfinished, because he didn't need to finish it. Everyone already understood. "Then maybe it's time you close that door for good." Silence followed. A cold, heavy silence that settled over the yard like the frost. Richard gave one last glance at the shop, then turned. "Let's go." Engines roared back to life. Doors slammed. Within seconds, the convoy pulled away, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks, exhaust, and a scattered heap of broken machines in the dirt. The crowd lingered for a moment. Someone muttered something under their breath. Another shook his head. Then one by one, they drifted off, boots crunching over frozen ground, until there was no one left. No one but Elias. And the machines. He stood there for a long time, not moving, the cold air biting at his face. Then slowly he stepped forward. He crouched beside the pile, picking up the cracked gear assembly the young engineer had mocked. He turned it in his hands, fingers tracing the worn edges. The stress marks, the tiny fractures that told a story most people would never notice. But Elias noticed. He always did. And I need to stop here for a moment, because what happened next doesn't make sense unless you understand something about the man standing there in the cold. Elias Turner had never planned to stay in Cedar Ridge. Not at first. He was born in 1942 in that same stretch of land where the workshop now stood, back when the road wasn't even paved. When winters were longer and machines were simpler, but no less stubborn. His father, Thomas Turner, had been a mechanic before the word carried any kind of respect. Back then, it wasn't a trade you studied. It was something you survived into. Something you learned because if you didn't, things broke. And when things broke, people didn't eat. Thomas didn't teach with books. He taught with silence. When Elias was 10 years old, his father took him into the workshop for the first time. Not to explain anything, not to show him how things worked. He simply pointed at an old tractor engine cracked open on the bench and said, "Listen." That was it. Elias stood there confused, until his father reached over, turned the crank slightly, and the engine gave a low, uneven groan. Again, Thomas said. They stood like that for hours, turning, listening, feeling. At first, Elias heard nothing but noise, but over time, patterns began to form. A knock that didn't belong, a rhythm that was just a little off, a vibration that carried more strain than it should have. Machines talk. His father said one evening, wiping his hands slowly. Most people just don't wait long enough to hear them. By 15, Elias could tell what was wrong with an engine before opening it. By 20, he could fix things other men had already given up on. But there was something else. Something his father never said directly, but showed in the way he worked. Not every machine was built the same, even when they came off the same line. Some had small differences. Tolerances. Materials. Adjustments made by hands instead of molds. Tiny details that could change everything if you knew where to look. Years later, when bigger companies moved in, bringing with them newer machines, sealed systems and manuals, thicker than the engines themselves, Elias watched quietly. People said it was progress. Faster, cleaner, smarter, and maybe it was. But there was something nobody noticed, or maybe nobody wanted to. Because what Elias saw wasn't just improvement. It was compromise. Parts made thinner to save cost. Systems made more complex, but less forgiving. Machines that worked perfectly until they didn't. And when they didn't, no one knew how to listen anymore. That was why he stayed. That was why he kept the shop. Not because he couldn't leave, but because he understood something most people had already forgotten. And standing there in the cold of that November morning, holding a broken piece of metal that everyone else had laughed at, Elias Turner heard something, not with his ears, but with everything he had learned every winter. He had lived through every machine he had brought back when no one else could. There was something wrong with these tools, not just broken, wrong. And what he would find in the hours that followed would change everything that winter. Because this story, despite what it looks like on the surface, was never really about broken tools. Elias didn't bring everything inside at once. He knew better than that. Instead, he carried the pieces one by one, like he was bringing in wounded animals, never rushing, never stacking them blindly. Each machine had its place. Each part had its own quiet space on the long wooden benches his father had built decades ago. By noon, the workshop no longer looked abandoned. It looked awake. The cracked gear assembly lay under the hanging lamp. The seized auger motor sat near the vise. The control module, modern, foreign, arrogant in its design, rested untouched on the far corner of the table. Elias stood in the middle of it all, hands on his hips, eyes moving slowly from one piece to another. Most people would have seen a pile of junk. Elias saw a pattern, but he didn't act on it yet. Instead, he picked up the simplest piece first, the hydraulic jack. Old model. Mechanical. No electronics. Just steel seals and pressure. He opened it slowly, listening as the bolts loosened. There was a faint resistance where there shouldn't have been, a hesitation. He paused. Then he turned the shaft again, slower this time. There, a soft, uneven drag. Not dirt, not rust. Stress. He leaned in closer, fingers brushing along the internal threads, eyes narrowing as he followed a hairline deformation that ran along the edge. Too clean to be accidental, too consistent. He set it aside. Next came the auger motor. This one was newer, heavier, built to look powerful. But when he lifted it, he noticed something subtle. The balance was off. Not by much, just enough that someone who didn't care wouldn't notice. But Elias cared. He cracked it open. Inside, the gears were worn, but not evenly. One side showed accelerated strain, as if the load had been forced beyond what it was designed to handle. He exhaled slowly. That wasn't misuse. That was design. By late afternoon, the shop had grown colder, the light outside turning pale and thin. Elias hadn't spoken a word all day. He moved from one machine to the next, opening, examining, setting aside. And the more he looked, the clearer it became. These tools hadn't just failed. They had failed in the same way, over and over again. Different machines, different functions. Same kind of weakness, same kind of break. He stopped at the control the one the young engineer had mocked him with. Elias didn't touch it right away. He simply stood there, looking at it, as if measuring something invisible. Then slowly he reached out and turned it over. The casing was scratched but intact. The damage was internal. Burned circuitry. Overloaded channels. He unscrewed the panel with steady hands. Inside was a maze of wires and boards, compact, efficient, and completely sealed off from the kind of adjustments older machines allowed. For a moment he said nothing. Then he leaned closer, and that was when he saw it, a tiny discoloration near one of the connectors, barely visible unless you knew where to look. A faint warping of the metal around it. Heat stress, but not from external conditions, from inside. Elias straightened slowly. The room felt quieter now, not empty, focused, because something didn't add up. These machines weren't failing randomly. They were being pushed just slightly beyond what they could safely handle. Not enough to break immediately, just enough to wear them down faster than anyone would expect. And that was when the first thought came to him, a quiet one. What if this wasn't an accident? He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to, because the answer wasn't in the idea. It was in the details, and the details were everywhere. Outside, the wind picked up brushing against the walls of the workshop, with a low, steady hum. The kind of sound that carried winter in it. Elias moved back to the bench, pulling one of the older machines closer. This one hadn't come from Hawkins' trucks. It had been sitting in the corner for years. An old grain separator motor. Heavy. Solid. Built in a time when machines were expected to outlive the men who used them. He opened it carefully. Inside, everything was different. Thicker gears. Wider tolerances. Reinforced joints. Not elegant, but honest. He ran his hand along the main drive shaft, feeling the weight of it, the balance. Then he looked back at the newer machines, and for the first time that day, a connection fully formed. Not every machine is built the same. His father's voice quiet and steady, somewhere deep in his memory. Elias stepped back, eyes moving between the old motor and the new parts laid out across the tables. They weren't just different. They were built on complete character. The old machines were made to endure. The new ones were made to perform. And that difference mattered more than anyone in Cedar Ridge realized, because winter wasn't a test of performance. It was a test of endurance. And Hawkins' machines, they weren't built for that. But I need to stop here for a moment because what Elias discovered next wasn't something you'd notice unless you had spent a lifetime looking for things that didn't quite belong. It was buried inside one of the smaller components, a drive coupling from a mid-range tractor system. At first glance, it looked identical to every other part around it. Same size, same shape, same polished finish. But when Elias held it up to the light, he noticed something subtle, a difference in the grain of the metal. He frowned, turned it slowly. Then he took a small file from the bench and scraped gently along the edge. The sound it made was different, softer, denser. He reached for another coupling from the pile and did the same. Higher pitch, lighter resistance. He compared them again, and this time, he saw it clearly. They were not the same. One was standard production. The other was something else. Elias's eyes narrowed. He moved quickly now, digging through the pile, until he found the machine that part had come from. A newer model, branded with Hawkins' insignia. He opened it, working with a precision that came not from speed, but from certainty. Inside, he found more of them. Not many. Just enough. Reinforced components hidden among standard ones. Stronger. More durable. Out of place. Elias sat back slowly. Because now the question wasn't whether these machines had a weakness. That part was obvious. The real question was, why would a company that knew how to build stronger parts choose not to use them everywhere? The answer came to him the same way most truths do. Quietly. Uncomfortably. Because if machines lasted too long, people wouldn't need to replace them. And if people didn't need to replace them, companies wouldn't grow. Elias looked around the workshop, at the broken tools, at the subtle patterns of failure, at the handful of hidden pieces that told a completely different story. And for the first time since the trucks had left that morning, there was something new in his expression. Not anger, not frustration, understanding. And that understanding changed everything, because now he knew two things. First, these machines could be fixed, not just patched, fixed, stronger than before. And second, when winter came, they would fail again. Not just one or two, all of them. And when that happened, people would have nowhere else to go. The wind outside howled louder now, pushing against the walls like it was trying to get in. Elias stood slowly, rolling his shoulders, as if settling into something he had already decided. He reached for the old motor again, then for the reinforced coupling, then for the broken parts laid out across his tables. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He simply began. And what he was about to build in that small, quiet workshop at the edge of Cedar Ridge wasn't just a repair. It was an answer to a question no one else had even realized was being asked. Because when the first real storm of that winter finally arrived, Cedar Ridge was going to learn the difference between something that looks strong and something that actually is. The first storm didn't announce itself with thunder. It arrived the way real winter always does, in places like Cedar Ridge. Quiet at first, almost polite. A thin sheet of snow overnight. A drop in temperature that turned breath into smoke before it left your mouth. The kind of cold that slipped into metal and stayed there. Most people didn't worry. Not yet, because the machines still started. The engines still turned over. And Hawkins Agritech was still running ads in town, promising efficiency, reliability, and a kind of modern certainty that felt reassuring, at least on paper. But 3 days later, the wind changed. It came down from the mountains in long, relentless waves, carrying ice with it. Not soft snow anymore. Hard, biting crystals that scraped against metal, worked their way into seams, into joints, into the smallest weaknesses. And that was when the first machine failed. It happened out on the Carter farm. A brand new feed auger installed just 2 months earlier seized mid-operation. The motor didn't just stall, it locked. Hard. As if something inside had given up all at once. They tried restarting it. Nothing. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and by morning, 2 more machines across town had stopped working. Then 12. What people didn't understand at first, what they didn't want to admit, was that the failures weren't random. They followed the same quiet pattern Elias had seen days earlier. Under strain, under cold, under time. The systems didn't break loudly. They simply reached their limit, and then they stopped. By the end of the week, Cedar Ridge wasn't just dealing with broken equipment. It was dealing with a problem that had teeth. Livestock needed feed, but the machines that moved it were failing. Water systems slowed. Transport vehicles struggled. And the more people relied on the newer systems to recover, the faster those systems collapsed under pressure. Hawkins Agritech tried to respond. Richard set up a temporary repair station near the center of town. Engineers worked long hours running diagnostics, replacing parts, rebooting systems. But there was one problem. They needed replacements, and the replacements weren't there. Most of the critical components had to be shipped in. Special orders, factory calibrated, precision parts that didn't exist on a shelf in Cedar Ridge, and the storm wasn't letting anything through. Trucks got stuck miles outside town. Roads iced over, supply lines slowed to a crawl. By the time Richard realized how serious it was, he was already behind. But this story, like I told you before, was never really about the machines alone. Because while the town was starting to panic, there was one place where the lights never went out. At the far end of Miller's Road, the old workshop door stayed open, day and night. Elias Turner didn't put up a sign. He didn't call anyone. He didn't need to. The first person came just after sunrise on the 6th day of the storm, a farmer named Daniel Briggs. He stood at the doorway for a moment, snow dusting his shoulders, hesitation written all over his face. This was the same man who had stood in that crowd days earlier. The same man who hadn't said a word when Elias was mocked. Now he couldn't meet his eyes. "My feed system's down," Daniel said quietly. "Tried everything." Elias nodded once. "Bring the motor." No lecture, no reminder, no bitterness. Just that. By midday, Daniel's machine was running again. Not just running, running steady, stronger than before. He didn't understand why. He didn't ask. He just paid, nodded, and left. But word travels fast when people are desperate. By the next morning, 3 more trucks showed up, then 6, then more than Elias could count without looking up from his work. And here's the part nobody forgot, because by the time the second wave of machines came in, people started to notice something strange. The ones Elias repaired didn't fail again, not in the cold, not under load, not even when pushed harder than before. They held, while everything else didn't. At first people called it luck, then coincidence, then something else entirely, because this wasn't just repair work anymore. This was something different. And it reached a point, inevitably, where even Richard Hawkins couldn't ignore it. He arrived without the convoy this time. Just one truck. No polished entrance, no audience. The storm had stripped that away. Snow clung to his coat as he stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the frozen ground. For a moment he stood there, looking at the workshop he had laughed at days before. The door was open. Light spilled out into the gray afternoon, and inside was a line of people. Richard walked in slowly past farmers he recognized, men who had signed contracts with him, trusted his systems, believed in what he sold. None of them spoke. They just stepped aside. Elias was at the bench working on a drive assembly, hands moving with the same quiet precision as always. He didn't look up. Not immediately. Richard waited. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't interrupt. "I need to stop here," Richard said finally. His voice lower than it had been before, stripped of its edge. "And ask you something." Elias tightened one bolt, then another, before setting the tool down. Only then did he look up. Richard hesitated, just for a second. Then he said it. "What are you doing to them?" It wasn't accusation. It was confusion, because what he had seen out there didn't make sense. Elias wiped his hands slowly, eyes steady. "I'm fixing them," he said. Richard shook his head. "No," he replied. "You're not just fixing them." Silence stretched between them. Then Elias reached behind him and picked up two metal couplings. He placed them on the bench, side by side. They looked identical to most people, but not to the two men standing there. "One of these," Elias said quietly, "is what you sell." He tapped the first one lightly. "The other is what you know how to build." He tapped the second. Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. He didn't need to, because in that moment, he understood exactly what Elias had found. And that was the part nobody in that room forgot. Because it wasn't just about broken machines anymore. It was about choices. Choices made in offices far away from fields like these. Choices about cost, about margins, about how long something should last, instead of how well it should endure. Elias leaned slightly against the bench, his voice still calm. "Cold doesn't break things," he said. "It just shows you where they were already weak." No one spoke. The wind outside howled against the walls louder now, like it was trying to push its way in and hear the rest. Richard looked around the shop, at the people, at the machines Elias had repaired, at the quiet certainty in the way everything worked. And for the first time since he had stepped into Cedar Ridge, he had nothing to say. He left not long after. No final word, no argument, just silence. But the story didn't end there, because winter didn't stop, and neither did Elias. For the next 3 weeks, that workshop never closed. Day and night, the light stayed on. People came from neighboring towns. Some drove hours through ice just to reach that crooked door at the end of Miller's Road. And every machine that left that shop carried something different inside it. Not just stronger parts, but understanding. By the time the storm finally broke, Cedar Ridge looked like a place that had been tested and somehow held together. Not because of systems, not because of technology, but because of one man who knew how to listen. Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted in uneven patches, revealing the same roads, the same fields. But something about the town had changed. People spoke differently, quieter, more careful. Hawkins Agritech was still there, but not the way it had been before. Contracts were questioned. Promises were examined. And for the first time, people started asking not just how something worked, but why it was built that way. As for Richard Hawkins, he came back once more. Not with trucks, not with engineers, just himself. He stood in the doorway again, much like Daniel had weeks earlier, the weight of something unspoken in the way he carried himself. Elias was at the bench. Of course he was. Some things don't change. Richard stepped inside. "I could have built them better," he said, after a moment. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't an excuse. It was something closer to a confession. Elias didn't answer right away. He finished what he was doing first. Then he set the tool down. "You still can," he said. That was all. No anger, no triumph, just truth. And maybe that was the part that stayed with Richard longer than anything else. Because being proven wrong in front of others, that fades. But being shown a better way, that stays. The workshop door never closed again after that winter. Not fully. Even on the coldest nights, there was always a line of light spilling out onto the dirt road. A quiet promise that something broken could still be made right if someone knew how to listen. And if there's anything worth remembering from Cedar Ridge, it's this. People are quick to laugh at what they don't understand. Quick to dismiss what looks old, what looks slow, what doesn't shine. But strength isn't always loud, and wisdom doesn't always look new. Sometimes it stands at the edge of town, in a crooked building with peeling paint, waiting patiently for the moment the world finally realizes it was never weak at all.